The research vessel, Theorem of Patience, hung in the black silence above a world that had been dead for longer than most civilizations had been alive. Yen 4 was a husk, a planet stripped of oceans and forests and every trace of the life that had once walked its surface. And the only reason anyone cared about it at all was because 3 months ago, a deep-range scanner had found something buried beneath its crust that should not have been there. A vault, massive and perfectly preserved, carved into bedrock, and lined with materials that no species in the Confederated Alliance could identify. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the back of the shuttle as it descended toward the dig site and watched the barren landscape scroll past the viewport, all gray dust and shattered ridgelines stretching to every horizon. And she thought about how strange it was that a dead world could feel so heavy with secrets. She was the only human on the 12-member research team, and she knew exactly why she was there. It was not because anyone believed she could contribute something the others could not. It was because the Alliance had a policy of including at least one representative from every member species on high-profile missions, and humanity was the newest and youngest member of the Confederacy. And someone in a government office somewhere had decided that a single human archaeologist would satisfy the requirement without causing any trouble. Senior Examiner Rothari had made this clear without ever saying it directly. He was a Velith, tall and sharp and ancient, with skin like cracked quartz, and eyes that caught the light in colors Elena did not have names for. And when he spoke to her, he used the same patient tone that a teacher might use with a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. Specialist Dren was different, a Korvathi with 4 thick arms and a face like hammered bronze. He was the team's field engineer, and he treated Elena the way he was, same way he treated everyone else, which meant he was gruff and blunt and occasionally rude, but at least he was honest about it. Archivist Sulin was the one who made Elena uneasy. A Pelori, slender and pale, with a sixth sense that allowed her to perceive electromagnetic fields the way others perceived sound or light. And from the moment they had entered orbit, Sulin had been quiet in a way that felt like she was listening to something no one else could hear. The vault was everything the scans had promised and more. They descended through a vertical shaft cut with impossible precision into the planet's bedrock, and emerged into a chamber so vast that their lights could not reach the far walls, and the air inside was cool and still and tasted like metal and time. Hundreds of artifacts sat on pedestals arranged in perfect rows that stretched into the darkness, and every single one of them was beautiful. Elena had seen alien technology before. Everyone had. These were different. They were not machines or tools or weapons. They were shapes, intricate geometric forms with internal lattices that looked like frozen motion, as if someone had caught light in the act of folding and turned it to stone. And each one was unique. No two the same size, or pattern, or color. And every single one of them was dead. No energy readings, no emissions, no heat, no vibration, nothing at all. They sat on their pedestals like sculptures in a museum, and they did not respond to anything the team tried. Rothari ran every scan in the Alliance database. Dren hit them with frequencies across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Sulin walked among them with her hands outstretched and her pale eyes closed, and none of it made any difference. On the second day, Rothari announced his preliminary conclusion. They were decorative, remnants of an aesthetic tradition belonging to whatever civilization had built the vault. Beautiful, but ultimately non-functional, like paintings or carvings. Sulin disagreed quietly from the corner of the room, where she had been sitting with her arms wrapped around herself. "There is pressure in that chamber," she said, and her voice was thin and careful. "Something enormous is holding its breath down there. I do not know what it is waiting for, but it is waiting." Rothari noted her objection in the mission log, and moved on. Elena said nothing during these discussions. She sat in the back, And she listened, and she did the one thing she had always done when she was trying to understand something she could not yet name. She drew. While the others used scanners and algorithms and sensors that could detect a single photon from 1,000 meters away, Elena sat on the cold floor of the vault with a notebook and a pencil, and she sketched each artifact by hand, recording its position and its shape, and the way the light moved inside its frozen lattice. Doing this on the second day, and stopped to watch for a moment, and she could tell he was trying to decide whether to be amused or impressed, and in the end, he simply nodded and walked on. It was on the third day that Elena noticed something wrong. She was comparing her sketches from the first day to the positions of the artifacts in front of her, a habit she had developed because her drawings were precise, and she trusted them more than she trusted her memory. And one of them did not match. It was a small object, no larger than her fist, asymmetric and dark, shaped like a knot of black metal that someone had tried to fold into itself. And on the first day, it had been sitting on a pedestal 12 rows from the entrance to the chamber. Now it was on a pedestal 5 rows from the entrance. Elena stared at her sketch, and then at the artifact, and then at her sketch again, and she felt something cold move through her chest that was not fear exactly, but was close. Enough to taste like it? She reported it to Rothery that evening. He reviewed the sensor logs, every camera and motion detector and spatial mapper the team had deployed, and none of them showed any movement of any kind, anywhere in the vault at any time. "Human error," he said, and his tone was not unkind, but it was final. "The vault is disorienting, and the rows are repetitive. It is easy to confuse positions. I would recommend relying on your scanner rather than your drawings." Elena nodded and said nothing, and went back to her quarters. But before she left the vault, she did one thing. She placed a tiny mark in chalk dust on the pedestal where the dark artifact now sat, and she measured its exact distance from the entrance with a tape measure and wrote the number in her notebook. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her bunk aboard the Theorem of Patience, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about a knot of dark metal on a pedestal, in dead vault, on a dead world. And just before she finally closed her eyes, she pulled up her personal camera feed, the one she had left running on a small tripod near the vault entrance, because she liked to review footage of her own work at the end of each day. The chalk mark was gone. The pedestal was empty, and the dark artifact was now sitting on the pedestal closest to the entrance of the vault, the one that faced the door she walked through every morning. And if she did not know better, she would have said it was waiting for her. Elena did not tell anyone what she had seen on the camera feed. Not yet, not until she was sure, because she had already been dismissed once, and she was not going to give Rothari a second chance to call it human error. Instead, she became very quiet and very careful and very patient. She set up a system over the next 2 days that no one on the team noticed, because no one on the team was paying attention to what the human was doing in the back of the vault. She placed chalk marks on every pedestal within 10 rows of the entrance. She ran thin threads of measuring tape between fixed points on the floor. She positioned 3 of her personal cameras at different angles, with time-lapse recording set to capture 1 frame every 30 seconds. And she logged the exact position of the dark artifact down to the millimeter in her notebook, every time she entered and every time she left. She called it La Sombra in her private notes, the shadow, because it moved without being seen, and because it followed, and it did follow. On the first test day, Elena entered the vault alone and sat in the far left corner for 3 hours and did nothing but read. And when she reviewed the time-lapse footage that night, she watched the dark artifact shift across its pedestal by 4 centimeters in the direction of the corner where she had been sitting. And the movement was so slow and so smooth that it looked less like something sliding and more like something growing toward the light. On the second day, she sat in the opposite corner, and it moved the other way. On the third day, she asked Dren to sit in the vault alone for 3 hours while she monitored from the ship, and the artifact did not move at all, not 1 millimeter, not 1 fraction of a degree. She asked Sulin to do the same, and got the same result. Nothing. She asked 2 other team members, and got nothing. Then she went back in herself, and sat in the center of the room, watched through her camera, as La Sombra crept toward her like a shy animal that wanted to be near someone, but did not yet know how to ask. On the 5th day, she had enough evidence to be undeniable. She called a full team meeting aboard the Theorem of Patience, and she connected her personal camera to the main display, and she played the time-lapse footage without saying a word. The room was silent as they watched the dark artifact move, slowly and impossibly, across its pedestal, toward the corner where Elena sat reading. And then she played the footage of it doing nothing when Dren was in the room, and then nothing when Sulin was in the room, and then moving again the moment Elena returned. Rothari stood very still, with his crystalline hands pressed flat against the table, and his strange eyes fixed on the screen. And for a long time he did not speak. The ship sensors recorded no movement, he said finally. I know, Elena said. That is why I used my own cameras. Whatever this object is doing, it is doing it in a way your sensors cannot detect. Sulin was standing in the far corner of the meeting room, and she was trembling, not dramatically, but in a fine, constant vibration that Elena could see in her fingertips. The pressure, Sulin whispered. It has changed. It was everywhere before, spread across the whole vault, like something asleep. But now it is directional. And she raised one pale hand and pointed directly at Elena. It points at her, all of it. The entire vault is pointing at her. The arguments started immediately, and they were loud, and they lasted for hours. Rothari wanted Elena removed from the mission for her own safety. 2 of the senior researchers agreed. One of them, a Tasic biologist, who argued that the artifact might be parasitic, and was targeting Elena because human neurology was vulnerable in ways they did not yet understand. Elena sat through all of it, and waited. Finished, she said the thing she had been thinking for 5 days. This is the first artifact in the vault that has responded to anything at all. Every scan and frequency and signal you have tried over the past 2 weeks has produced nothing. And now something is finally reacting. It is reacting to me. If you remove me, you lose the only lead you have. Dren leaned back in his chair and folded 2 of his 4 arms across his chest, and said, She is right, and you know it. Rothari looked at Elena for a long time, and then he looked at the frozen frame on the display, where La Sombra sat on its pedestal, angled toward the corner where she had been sitting. And something shifted in his expression that might have been the beginning of respect. He agreed to let her stay. Elena began spending hours alone with La Sombra every day after that. She held it in her hands, and it was warm, not the cold of dead metal that every other team member had reported when they touched it, but warm like something alive, warm like skin, warm like it was glad to be held. She talked to it because it felt right, not because she expected an answer, but because sitting in silence with something that was clearly aware of her felt strange and a little rude. So she told it about Earth, and about the ocean she grew up near, and about the way sunlight looked when it came through water. And she knew the others thought she was being foolish, but she did not care, because something in her gut told her that this mattered, that the talking mattered, that La Sombra was listening, in whatever way it knew how to listen. And then, one evening, as the artificial lights in the vault dimmed to their night cycle, Elena was holding La Sombra in her lap, and looking at the rows of silent artifacts, stretching away into the dark. And the thought came to her so clearly that it felt less like a thought, and more like something she had always known, but had only just found the words. 4. The pedestals were not display stands. The artifacts were not arranged for viewing. Every single one of them was facing the entrance. They were not decorations in a museum. They were not trophies, or art, or relics of a dead aesthetic tradition. They were all sitting in the same direction, all oriented toward the door, all waiting, The entire vault was a waiting room, and every artifact in it had been placed there to wait for someone specific to walk through that door. La Sombra was simply the first one to recognize who it had been waiting for. Elena held the dark knot of metal against her chest, and she felt its warmth pulse against her heartbeat, and she whispered, "How long have you been waiting?" And then its frozen lattice moved. Not much, not fast, just a slow turning, deep inside its structure, like something waking up after a sleep so long it had forgotten what waking felt like. And Elena watched, with her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, as the internal geometry of La Sombra began to shift and turn and unfold like a flower made of mathematics. Her comm unit screamed to life with Sulin's voice, and even through the tiny speaker, Elena could hear that the Pelori was terrified. Every artifact in the vault just produced an energy spike, Sulin was shouting. Every single one, simultaneous, 1/10 of a second, and then dark again. All except the one you are holding, Elena. The one you are holding is not going dark. It is building. It is getting stronger. What did you do? What did you do? Elena looked down at La Sombra in her hands, and it was humming now, a low sound she could feel in her bones more than she could hear in her ears, and its lattice was turning faster, and the warmth was spreading up through her fingers and into her wrists, and she was not afraid. She was not afraid at all. La Sombra did not stop humming after that night, and Elena did not stop holding it. The sound it made was low and constant, somewhere beneath the range of normal hearing, but heavy enough to settle into the bones of anyone who stood close. And the team could feel it through the floor of the vault when they entered. A vibration like the memory of a heartbeat buried under stone. Its internal lattice was fully alive now, turning in patterns so complex that the ship's computers could not model them, folding and unfolding in geometries that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. And when Elena held it in her hands, the lattice moved faster, brighter, warmer, as if her presence was fuel for whatever engine had finally woken inside it. When anyone else picked it up, the lattice slowed, and the warmth faded, and the hum dropped to almost nothing, like a fire being smothered. Rothari ordered round-the-clock monitoring, and Elena did not argue, because she understood his fear, even if she did not share it. Something ancient and unknown had activated in response to a single human, and no one, including Elena, knew what it was going to do next. The answer came from 900 light-years away. 3 days after La Sombra woke up, the Confederated Species Alliance sent a priority communique to the Theorem of Patience, marked with the highest classification level Elena had ever seen. A Pelori deep space array on the far side of the galaxy had detected an energy pulse, brief and impossibly powerful, originating from the coordinates of Yen 4. And the pulse had traveled faster than light, in ways that violated every known law of physics. Whatever La Sombra had done when it flickered that first night, it had not just woken up. It had sent a signal, a broadcast into the dark, and someone or something 900 light-years away had heard it. The Alliance was afraid, and when the Alliance was afraid, it sent warships. 10 days before the military escort arrived, and she intended to use every one of them. Dren was the one who made the breakthrough that changed everything. He had been analyzing the harmonic tone La Sombra produced since the night it woke, and he had been treating it as sound, as vibration, as a physical phenomenon, and he had gotten nowhere. But on the 4th day he ran it through a data compression algorithm on a hunch, and the results made him sit very still at his console for a long time. "It is not a sound," he told Elena that evening in the mess hall, his 4 hands wrapped around a cup of something hot. "It is a language. The hum is a compressed data stream. There is information encoded in it, massive amounts, more than I have ever seen packed into a single carrier wave. Something inside that artifact is trying to talk to you." Elena and Dren worked together after that, side by side in the vault, Elena holding La Sombra while Dren ran decompression algorithms on the signal it produced, and what they found inside was a puzzle. Not a simple puzzle, not a cipher or a code, but a living adaptive test that changed itself in real time, based on who was attempting to solve it. When Rathari tried, the puzzle became so abstract that it resembled pure philosophy, questions without answers folding into questions without questions, and he withdrew after 2 hours with something close to frustration on his crystalline face. When Dren tried, the puzzle became an endless loop of engineering schematics that referenced themselves in circles, each solution becoming the next problem, and he laughed and shook his head and said whatever built this has a sense of humor. When Elena tried, the puzzle simplified. Not because it thought she was stupid, she could feel that much. The simplification was not condescension, it was calibration. It was the puzzle reaching out and feeling the shape of her mind, and adjusting itself to fit the way she thought. And the way she thought was not like the way Rathari thought, or Dren thought. It was less linear, and less structured, and more intuitive. It moved in leaps rather than steps. It followed feelings before it followed logic, and the puzzle seemed to recognize this and welcome it. Elena solved the first layer in 6 hours. It was not like unlocking a door, it was like falling through one. One moment, she was sitting in the vault, holding a warm knot of metal, and the next moment, the vault was gone, and she was somewhere else entirely. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The Cathara showed her what they had been. She saw them as they were at their peak, a civilization that stretched across 1,000 star systems, builders and dreamers and artists whose technology was so advanced that the distinction between science and magic had dissolved like salt in water. They reshaped planets and redirected rivers of starlight, and they built structures that sang in frequencies that could be heard across galaxies, and she felt them as they began to die, not in war, not in plague, not in any of the dramatic catastrophes that usually ended civilizations. The Cathara died of something much quieter and much worse. They stopped wondering. It happened so slowly that they did not notice. Each generation a little more precise, a little more calculated, a little more perfect, and a little less alive. They optimized everything, including themselves. They removed inefficiency and irrationality and impulse. They made their minds into flawless instruments of logic, and in doing so, they cut away the very thing that had made them reach for the stars in the first place. The last generation of the Cathara could solve any equation, and answer any question, and build anything they could imagine, but they could no longer imagine anything worth building. They died not with a scream, but with a silence, a slow, quiet fading, like a song that forgets its own melody. But before they faded completely, they did one final thing, one last act, born from the faint echo of the wonder they had lost. They built the seeds. Hundreds of them, each one encoded with a piece of their collective knowledge, each one calibrated to respond to a specific cognitive signature, and they scattered them across dead worlds throughout the galaxy, placed them in vaults and buried them deep, and set them to wait. Each seed was designed to activate only when it encountered a mind that matched its particular frequency. Not intelligence exactly, not knowledge, but something deeper, a way of thinking, a way of being, a shape of consciousness that resonated with the specific gift the seed carried. La Sombra had been built to wait for a mind that felt before it thought, a mind that would sketch a relic by hand when scanners were available, a mind that would talk to an object it could not understand because silence felt wrong. That would trust its gut when every instrument said there was nothing to find. A mind that was messy and irrational and stubbornly alive in all the ways the Cathara had forgotten how to be. A human mind. Elena came back to herself in the vault, with tears running down her face, and La Sombra pulsing warm against her palms, and she understood now why it had chosen her. Not because humans were special in the way the galaxy usually measured special. Not because they were powerful or ancient or wise. Because they were what the Cathara used to be, before they lost themselves. Because they still had the one thing that no amount of technology could replace, and no amount of optimization could improve. They still wondered. Elena wiped her eyes and held La Sombra against her chest, and she could feel it humming with something that was not sound and was not language, but was close to gratitude. And she whispered, "I understand now." And the lattice inside the dark metal turned once, slowly, like a nod. The moment was broken by the sound of boots in the corridor outside the vault. Admiral Calith of the Velith Navy had arrived 3 days ahead of schedule, and he had not come to study the artifacts. He had come to take them. Elena heard his voice before she saw him, sharp and cold and used to being obeyed, ordering his soldiers to secure the perimeter and prepare for artifact extraction. And she heard Rothari's voice rising in protest and being cut short. And she heard Dren swearing in Korvathi, which was an impressive thing to hear. The admiral appeared at the entrance to the vault, tall even for a Velith, his crystalline skin polished to a military shine, and behind him stood a dozen armed soldiers, and Elena looked at them, and then looked down at La Sombra in her hands, and she felt the hum change. It was not louder, it was deeper, and it was not just La Sombra anymore. Every artifact in the vault lit up at the same time, hundreds of them, a wave of light rolling through the darkness like dawn breaking underground. And the harmonic tone that had lived in La Sombra alone swelled into a sound that came from everywhere, from the walls and the floor and the stone itself, a sound so deep and so heavy that it shook dust from the ceiling and cracked the surface of the nearest pedestal. And Elena felt it in her teeth and in her spine, and in the spaces between her heartbeats. The vault was awake. The soldiers tried to enter the vault, and the vault said no. It was not violent, and it was not dramatic. There was no explosion, and no blast of energy, and no weapon fired. There was simply a wall, invisible and absolute, that formed across the entrance like the air itself had turned to glass. And when the first soldier walked into it, he stopped as if he had hit stone and stumbled backward. And the soldier behind him tried to push through and could not. And the admiral himself placed his crystalline hand against the barrier and pushed with the kind of force that could bend metal. And nothing happened, nothing at all. The barrier did not flex or vibrate or react in any way. It simply existed, and it was clear to everyone watching that it would continue to exist for exactly as long as it wanted to. On the other side of the barrier, Elena stood alone in a vault full of light. Every artifact was glowing now, not the brief flicker of that first night, but a sustained radiance. That turned the underground chamber into something that looked like a cathedral made of stars. And the harmonic tone had settled into a frequency that Elena could feel in her chest like a second heartbeat. Steady and warm and patient. La Sombra was changing in her hands. The knot of dark metal was unfolding, slowly and deliberately, its surfaces peeling apart and rearranging themselves into something new. And Elena watched as the shape she had carried for weeks transformed into something that fit her grip perfectly. Something that felt like it had been made for her hands specifically. Not a weapon and not a tool, but a key. A key to something she could not yet see, but could feel pressing against the edges of her mind like a question waiting to be asked. The question came not in words, but in feeling. A gentle pressure against her consciousness that carried meaning the way music carries emotion, and it asked her something simple and enormous at the same time. Carry what we could not. Elena closed her eyes, and she could hear Admiral Calith shouting on the other side of the barrier, and she could hear Rothari arguing with him, in a voice she had never heard Rothari use before, loud and fierce and unwilling to yield. And she could hear Dren somewhere on the ship's comm channel, swearing and working, and trying to decode the data stream that was now pouring from every artifact in the vault, like a river that had been dammed for millennia and finally set free. She heard Rothari say something that surprised her. "You will not extract her by force," Rothari said to the Admiral, and his voice was the voice of someone who had spent centuries studying dead things, and had just realized that the thing in front of him was magnificently alive. This vault is a functioning system, and she is the interface. If you break the connection, you could destroy everything. The artifacts, the data, the vault itself, and possibly her. You do not have the authority to allow or disallow anything, Caliph said. Then you will have to remove me as well, Rothari said, and Elena opened her eyes because she had not expected that. Not from him, not from the person who had dismissed her sketches as human error and treated her presence as a diplomatic inconvenience. On the ship, Dren was shouting into the comm with a kind of wild joy that sounded almost dangerous. I have decoded the deeper layers, he said. The artifacts are not just knowledge stores. They are gifts. Each one contains a specific technology or insight that the builders wanted to pass on, but there is a safeguard built into the system. The gifts can only be unlocked by the bonded individual, and only if the individual chooses freely. Coercion breaks the bond. Do you understand what I'm saying, Admiral? If you force her, you get nothing, less than nothing. You destroy the only chance anyone has of accessing what is inside these. Caliph went quiet, and Elena could feel the weight of his silence through the barrier. Inside the vault, the question was still waiting for her answer, and the Cathara were showing her more now. Not just memories, but understanding. They showed her the full shape of what they had been, and what they had lost, and why they had spent their final years building seeds instead of monuments. They showed her their last cities, beautiful and empty and perfect, where nothing was out of place, and nothing was surprising, and nothing was new, where every problem had been solved so completely that no one remembered what it felt like to have a problem. And Elena felt the horror of it, not the horror of destruction, but the horror of completion, the terrible quiet of a species that had answered every question and found that the answers were not enough. They showed her humanity, and she saw her own species through ancient alien eyes, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. They saw the mess, the contradiction, the violence and the tenderness existing side by side, the capacity to wage war and compose music in the same century, to split atoms and write love letters with the same hands, to build systems of perfect logic and then ignore them because something in the gut said otherwise. And the Cathara did not see this as primitive. They envied it. They envied the irrationality, the stubbornness, the refusal to be optimized. They envied the way humans loved without calculating the cost, and created without knowing the purpose, and kept reaching for things they could not name. And Elena felt their envy like heat, and it was not bitter. It was wistful. It was the envy of someone watching a child play and remembering what it felt like before play became performance, became productivity, became nothing at all. The inheritance was offered to her plainly and without conditions. The knowledge within La Sombra, technologies that could advance humanity by 1,000 years. Understandings of physics and biology and energy that the Cathara had spent millennia perfecting. All of it encoded and compressed and waiting to be unpacked by a mind that was willing to receive it. But the final message was a warning, and Elena felt it not as words, but as the deepest thing the Cathara had left to say. Do not become us. The knowledge is a tool. Wonder is the hand that wields it. If you trade one for the other, you will build our tomb again. If you let the answers kill the questions, you will end where we ended, in beautiful, perfect silence, with nothing left to say. Elena stood in the light of 100 ancient artifacts, and she held the key the Cathara had made for her, and she said yes. Not out loud, not in words. She said it the way the Cathara had asked, with feeling, with the part of her mind that moved before thought, with the part that had drawn sketches when scanners were available, talked to a dead object in a dead vault, because silence felt wrong, the part that was stubbornly and irrationally and wonderfully human. La Sombra dissolved. It did not break or shatter or disappear. It dissolved like light dissolving into dawn, and the knowledge flowed into Elena, not as data or information, but as understanding, deep and layered and vast, settling into her mind the way sediment settles to the bottom of a river, slowly and naturally, and with the patience of something that knew it had all the time in the world. She was not transformed. She was not made superhuman. She did not glow or float or speak in ancient languages. She was still Elena Vasquez, still human, still small and tired, and standing in a vault on a dead world with chalk dust on her fingers. But she knew things she had not known before, and she understood that the knowing was not meant for her alone. It was too much for one mind, too vast for one lifetime. It was meant to be shared and studied and argued about and built upon by generations. It was a beginning, not an ending, a question, not an answer. The vault went quiet. The artifacts dimmed from blinding radiance to a soft, gentle glow, and the barrier at the entrance dissolved as silently as it had appeared. And Elena walked out of the chamber on steady legs, and found Admiral Kalis and Rothari and a dozen soldiers staring at her in the kind of silence that happens when people do not know whether they have witnessed a miracle or a catastrophe. Caliph spoke first, and his voice had an edge that was half command and half fear. "You will submit to containment and debriefing aboard my vessel." Elena looked at him, and she looked at Rothari, and she reached into the vast new architecture of knowledge settling into her mind. And she found something small and specific, and she said it calmly. She recited the energy loss equations that governed Velith crystalline biology, the equations that covered ... described how their silicon-based cellular structures degraded over time, the equations that the Velith themselves had been trying to solve for 400 years, and she recited them perfectly and completely, and watched the Admiral's face change from authority to shock, to something that looked very much like awe. The room was silent for a long time. Then Elena said, "The Cathara left 1,000 gifts on 1,000 dead worlds. This one was meant for us, not because we are the strongest, or the smartest, or the oldest, because we are the ones who still wonder. And if you try to lock that away in a vault, you will be making the same mistake they did." 6 months later, the galaxy was still arguing about what had happened on Yen 4, and Elena Vasquez suspected it would keep arguing for a very long time, which was fine with her, because arguing meant thinking and thinking meant wondering, and wondering was the whole point. The political fallout had been immense in ways that Elena had anticipated and in ways that she had not. Admiral Kalith had returned to Alliance Command and recommended that Elena be detained and the vault be classified at the highest level, and all data from the mission be sealed for 100 years. And for 3 days, it looked like the Alliance would agree. The preliminary vote in the Confederated Council leaned toward containment by a margin of 11 species to 4, and Elena had sat in a holding room aboard a military station and watched through a viewport as warships gathered in formation around Yen 4 like predators circling a kill. Then Rothari did something that no senior examiner in the history of the Velith Academy had ever done before. He broke protocol. He transmitted his complete mission logs, all of them, every scan and every recording and every frame of Elena's time-lapse footage and every decoded fragment of the Kethera data stream, to every scientific institution on every world in the Confederacy. And he did it on an open channel that anyone with a receiver could access. And by the time Alliance Command realized what had happened, the data was everywhere, copied and mirrored and shared across 1,000 networks on 100 worlds. Dren helped him do it, naturally. Dren had written the distribution algorithm in under an hour, and when he was later asked why he had committed what was technically an act of treason, he shrugged with all 4 shoulders and said, "The dead do not get to keep secrets that belong to the living." Sulin had contributed too. She had added her own sensory recordings to the transmission, the raw electromagnetic data. She had felt in the vault the pressure and the directionality and the moment when every artifact had woken at once, and her recordings carried a weight that mere numbers could not, because when other Palori experienced them, they wept. They said it was like hearing a voice calling from the bottom of an ocean of time. The Alliance could not classify what everyone already knew. The story of the Cathara spread across the galaxy like fire across a dry field, and it changed things in ways that no one had predicted. The knowledge Elena carried was extraordinary. Technologies that could reshape energy production and medicine and material science and a dozen other fields. And she shared all of it freely and without restriction through the institution she founded. But it was not the technology that changed the galaxy. It was the story. An ancient civilization, older and more powerful than anything the modern galaxy had ever imagined, had looked across the stars and chosen to leave its legacy, not to the species that was most advanced or most logical or most worthy by any conventional measure, but to the species that was most alive, the species that was messy and loud and contradictory and stubborn, the species that painted pictures on cave walls before it invented the wheel, that wrote poetry before it understood mathematics, that reached for the moon not because reaching was efficient, but because the moon was there and it was beautiful, and not reaching for it was unthinkable. Humanity had been the youngest member of the Alliance, tolerated and patronized and assigned to the back of every room. And overnight, that changed. They were not the young ones anymore. They were the seed carriers, the species the Cathara had trusted with wonder, and every other civilization in the galaxy had to sit with the uncomfortable question of what it meant that the ancients had looked at them and looked at humans and chosen the humans, resented it. And Elena understood that and did not blame them. Some species were curious and came to study and to learn, and Elena welcomed all of them. Some species looked inward and asked themselves whether they too had begun to lose the thing the Cathara had warned about, whether optimization and advancement had started to quietly replace the wonder that had driven them to the stars in the first place. And those conversations were the ones Elena valued most, because they meant the Cathara's warning was being heard. Elena established the Vasquez Institute on a small green moon orbiting a yellow star that reminded her of home, and she built it with 3 principles that she refused to compromise on. The knowledge would be shared with all species equally. No government or corporation or military would receive preferential access. The doors would be open to anyone who came to learn, and the Institute would never stop asking questions, even after it found answers. Dren became the Institute's chief engineer, and he was magnificent at it. His 4 hands always building something, always testing, always breaking things apart to understand how they worked. And he brought a joy to the work that Elena relied on more than she ever told him. Rothari became the academic director, and he was quiet and meticulous, and he ran the research programs with the same precision he had once used to dismiss Elena's sketches. But now that precision was in service of something he believed in, and sometimes Elena caught him standing alone in the Institute's central hall, staring at a holographic projection of the Cathara data, with an expression on his crystalline face that looked very much like wonder. Sulan led a new expedition, a fleet of Pelori sensor ships that scattered across the galaxy, searching for other vaults on other dead worlds. Because the Cathara had not built only one seed, and they had not hidden them all in the same place. Somewhere out there in the dark were hundreds more artifacts waiting on hundreds more pedestals for hundreds more minds to walk through the door. The reports started coming in within the first 3 months. A Korvathi researcher on a frozen moon at the edge of known space sent a message to the Institute at 2 a.m, her voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. She had found a vault beneath the ice, and inside it a crystalline rod had begun to vibrate the moment she entered the chamber. Not for any of her colleagues, just for her, just for the particular shape of her Korvathi mind. A Pelori child visiting a natural history museum on her homeworld touched a stone sphere that had been sitting in a display case for 200 years. catalogued as a geological curiosity, and it glowed, soft and warm, and the museum staff called the institute in a panic. And Elena laughed when she heard the story, because of course it was a child. Of course it was someone who still touched things in museums just to see what would happen. A Velith mathematician reported that a triangular artifact, recovered from an asteroid belt, had begun projecting equations into his dreams. And the equations were beautiful, he said, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen, and he woke each morning, weeping and reaching for a pen. The seeds were waking up everywhere, not just for humans, for everyone. Each one calibrated to a different kind of mind, a different way of thinking, a different flavor of wonder. And Elena watched the reports come in, and she felt something in her chest that was too large for a single word, but that contained gratitude and relief and hope and a fierce protective love for every species in the galaxy that was still capable of being surprised. The Cathara had not left their legacy for humanity alone. They had left it for everyone. But it was a human who had woken them first, a human who had drawn sketches when scanners were available, a human who had talked to dead metal because silence felt wrong, a human who had trusted her gut in a room full of people who trusted only their instruments. And that meant something. It meant something to every species in the galaxy, even the ones who did not want to admit it. 6 months and 12 days after the vault on Yehen 4 had opened its eyes, Elena went back. She took a shuttle down alone. She did not tell anyone she was going. She just woke early and dressed, and flew down through the gray atmosphere to the barren surface, and walked through the familiar corridors to the chamber where it had all begun. The vault was empty now. The artifacts had been carefully and reverently removed and distributed to research teams across the galaxy. The pedestals stood bare in their perfect rows, and the air was cool and still, and tasted like metal and time, just as it had on the first day. Elena walked to the center of the chamber, and she stood where she had stood on the night La Sombra dissolved into light, and she placed her hand against the wall. It was warm, not the cold of dead stone on a dead world, warm, the same warmth she had felt in La Sombra, the same warmth that had pressed against her palms on all those long evenings when she had sat in this room and talked to something ancient and lonely and patient. She whispered, "Thank you for waiting," and deep beneath the stone, deep beneath the bedrock and the silence and the millennia of darkness, something hummed. Not a machine, and not an echo, and not a memory. A reply, faint and real and alive, and the warmth spread beneath her fingers like a hand pressing back against hers from the other side of a wall that was very thin and very old. Elena smiled. She stood there for a while longer, with her hand against the warm stone, and then she turned and walked out of the vault, and up through the corridors, and out into the pale light of Yen 4, where her shuttle sat, waiting on the gray dust. Above her the stars were bright and countless and full of sleeping gifts that were beginning to dream of waking. And somewhere out there in the vast and ancient dark, 1,000 seeds sat on 1,000 pedestals on 1,000 dead worlds, waiting with the patience of something that had all the time in the universe for the right mind to walk through the door. And because of one human woman, with a notebook and a pencil, and the stubbornness to trust what she felt over what she was told, the galaxy was finally beginning to remember how to wonder.